In 1945, the world exhaled. The guns had gone silent. Hitler was dead. Japan had surrendered. But in the ashes of victory, a new war was already beginning. A war without open battlefields. A war fought not for land, but for the mind of mankind itself. This was the Cold War. When World War II ended, two superpowers stood tall above the ruins, the United States of America and the Soviet Union. Both had fought a common enemy, but shared nothing else. One stood for freedom, capitalism, and democracy. The other promised equality, communism, and control. For a brief moment, the world believed peace had returned. But peace is fragile, and fear spreads fast. At the Yalta Conference, Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin smiled for the cameras, but behind the smiles there was mistrust, thick as smoke. The West feared Stalin's ambition. The Soviets feared being encircled and invaded again. And both sides, in truth, feared each other's ideology more than any weapon. The war had left Europe shattered. Cities lay in rubble. Millions were dead. And into that vacuum of power stepped two titans with competing visions for the future. To the Americans, capitalism had triumphed. To the Soviets, communism had endured, and both wanted to reshape the world in their image. Germany, once the heart of the Nazi machine, became the stage for the first confrontation. The country was carved into zones. The city of Berlin, though deep inside Soviet territory, was split, half capitalist, half communist. And it wouldn't be long before the walls, both visible and invisible, began to rise. In Washington, President Harry Truman declared a new era. The United States would support any nation resisting subjugation by armed minorities or outside pressures. It was a polite way of saying, we will stop communism everywhere. In Moscow, Stalin called it imperialism in disguise. Two men, two ideologies, and a planet caught between them. The weapons had changed, but the fear had not. In place of tanks and bombers, the Cold War began with ideas, propaganda, promises, and paranoia. Radio Free Europe broadcast jazz and democracy. The Soviets countered with Marx and Lenin on every schoolbook page. From Hollywood to the Kremlin, stories became soldiers in this invisible war. It didn't take long for the tension to explode. In 1948, Stalin cut off all access to West Berlin. No food, no fuel, no way out. He wanted to choke the western sectors into surrender. But the United States responded with something audacious: the Berlin airlift. For 11 months, American and British planes flew over 270,000 missions, dropping 2.3 million tons of supplies to the trapped citizens of Berlin. Flour, coal, milk, even chocolate for the children. And it worked. The airlift broke Stalin's blockade without firing a single shot. The Cold War had found its first victory and its first scar. By 1949, the world had drawn its lines. In the West, NATO was born, a military alliance led by the United States. In the East, the Soviet Union tightened its control, forming the Warsaw Pact years later. The Iron Curtain had fallen, not made of steel, but of fear. Winston Churchill had warned of it years earlier. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an Iron Curtain has descended across the continent. And behind that curtain, millions of people vanished from Western view. Then came the unthinkable. In August 1949, the Soviet Union detonated its first atomic bomb. The monopoly was over. Now 2 nations could erase humanity with the push of a button. The United States responded by developing the hydrogen bomb, a weapon 1,000 times more powerful. The arms race had begun, and there was no finish line. In the following years, spies replaced soldiers, submarines prowled under polar ice, and schoolchildren in America practiced hiding under desks, as if wood could stop fire from the sun. It was an age of dread and an age of dreams, because even as fear spread, technology soared. Satellites, rockets, computers, all born from the rivalry that threatened to destroy the world. The Cold War wasn't just about survival. It was about proving who deserved to lead humanity into the future. But as the 1950s dawned, a new front was opening, not in Europe, but across the globe. From the jungles of Asia to the deserts of the Middle East, nations newly freed from colonial rule were being courted or coerced by both sides, and soon the Cold War would no longer be cold. June 25, 1950. The Cold War suddenly turned hot. On the Korean Peninsula, troops from the Communist North stormed across the 38th parallel, invading the South. It was the first major military clash of the post-war world, and the first time the superpowers would test their will through proxy war. The United States, under the United Nations banner, rushed to defend the South. The Soviet Union quietly supplied the North. And soon 500,000 Chinese troops poured in, turning the conflict into a blood-soaked stalemate. By the war's end, millions were dead, and nothing had changed. The border returned to where it began. But the message was clear. The Cold War could turn deadly anywhere, anytime. As the 1950s unfolded, the 2 superpowers began a deadly dance. Each move answered with another. If one side built a bomb, the other built 2. If one gained an ally, the other funded a revolution. The competition wasn't only about weapons, it was about worldview. America framed itself as the guardian of freedom, the Soviet Union as the liberator of the oppressed, and every newly independent nation, from Africa to Asia, became a prize on the global chessboard. At home, fear took a different shape. In the United States, whispers of communist spies spread like wildfire. Senator Joseph McCarthy claimed traitors had infiltrated every level of government, Hollywood, even the army. For years, paranoia ruled. People lost jobs, reputations, even friendships, not because of what they'd done, but what they were accused of believing. It was called the Red Scare, a reminder that the Cold War wasn't just fought abroad, it was fought in the hearts of ordinary people. Then something extraordinary happened. A sphere no bigger than a beach ball streaked across the sky. Sputnik. The first artificial satellite, launched by the Soviet Union, orbited the Earth. To the world, it was a technological marvel. To America, it was terror. If the Soviets could launch a satellite, they could launch a missile. And suddenly, the Cold War wasn't just about ideology. It was about space. The space race had begun. In schools, American children were told to study science. In Moscow, engineers were heroes, and above them, the heavens became a new battlefield. Sputnik was followed by Laika, the dog who became the first living creature in orbit. Then Yuri Gagarin, the first man to touch the stars. Each Soviet triumph was a headline and a humiliation for the West. But America would strike back. In 1961, President John F. Kennedy set a goal that electrified a generation. We choose to go to the moon. The race for the heavens was on, and behind the scenes, so was the race for survival. Just 90 miles off the coast of Florida, a revolution had brought Fidel Castro to power. He aligned with Moscow, defying Washington. And in October 1962, American spy planes discovered something shocking: Soviet nuclear missiles on Cuban soil. The world froze. For 13 days, humanity teetered on the edge of extinction. In secret meetings, Kennedy's advisors debated: invade Cuba, strike the missile sites, or risk global nuclear war. Soviet ships steamed toward a U.S. naval blockade. Nuclear bombers were armed. Every trigger was half pulled. And then, a message. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev offered a deal: remove the missiles from Cuba, and the U.S. would remove its own from Turkey. Kennedy agreed, in silence, and the world exhaled again. For the first time, the Cold War had come within hours of ending humanity. Both sides realized victory could mean mutual annihilation. In the years that followed, an uneasy calm settled in. Diplomats called it détente, a thawing of the ice. But beneath the surface, the race never stopped. Nuclear stockpiles grew to tens of thousands. Submarines patrolled with missiles capable of destroying cities in minutes. Spy satellites hovered silently in orbit. Both sides built weapons so powerful they could never use them, because using them would mean the end of everything. While the Cold War froze in Europe, Southeast Asia burned. In Vietnam, a small conflict between the Communist North and the U.S.-backed South spiraled into one of the longest, bloodiest wars in modern history. For the United States, it was a fight to stop communism spread. For the Soviet Union, it was a chance to bleed America without direct confrontation. Helicopters thundered over jungles. Napalm fell like rain. Millions died, soldiers and civilians alike. And when the last U.S. troops withdrew in 1973, North Vietnam stood victorious. For the first time, America had lost, and the world took notice. Back home, the illusion of invincibility cracked. Protests filled the streets. Faith in government waned. The image of America, the shining light of democracy, grew dimmer. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union celebrated, but their victory was hollow. Their economy was faltering, their people weary. Both superpowers had spent billions fighting shadows, and neither was winning. President Richard Nixon, a staunch anti-communist, did something no one expected. He went to China. The world watched in disbelief as an American president shook hands with Mao Zedong. It was a strategic masterstroke: divide the communist bloc, ease tensions, and open new channels for peace. Soon after, Nixon met with Brezhnev in Moscow, signing the SALT I Treaty, the first agreement to limit nuclear arms. For a moment, it seemed the world might step back from the brink. But history rarely moves in straight lines. In 1979, Soviet tanks rolled into Afghanistan. To Washington, it was proof that Moscow's ambition had returned. To Moscow, it was a desperate attempt to control a crumbling sphere of influence. The U.S. responded by funding Afghan rebels, the Mujahideen, arming them with modern weapons. Among their ranks were men who would later shape the next century in ways no one could imagine. The Cold War's final front had begun, and its cost would be enormous. By the dawn of the 1980s, the world had lived under the shadow of annihilation for more than 3 decades. Children had grown up never knowing a day without fear. Politicians spoke of peace while building bigger bombs. And somewhere deep in the Kremlin, a new leader was rising, one who would change everything. By the early 1980s, the Cold War had lasted nearly 40 decades. 2 generations had lived beneath the shadow of the mushroom cloud. The world was exhausted, morally, economically, spiritually. But the storm wasn't over yet. The arms race had reached its fever pitch. Both sides now possessed enough nuclear weapons to destroy the planet several times over. Submarines prowled the oceans, missiles waited in silos, bombers circled the skies, a constant ballet of mutually assured destruction. And in the middle of it all stood 2 men who could end the world with a single command. A new president took the oath of office, Ronald Reagan. A Hollywood actor turned politician, Reagan came into power with a simple message: peace through strength. To his supporters, he was the man who would restore American confidence. To the Soviets, he was a nightmare. Reagan called the Soviet Union an evil empire. He poured billions into rebuilding the U.S. military, developing advanced weapons, and launching a visionary and controversial plan, the Strategic Defense Initiative, or Star Wars, a proposed shield that could shoot down nuclear missiles from space. To many, it was science fiction. To Moscow, it was an existential threat. By then, the Soviet Union was beginning to crack. Years of military spending had drained its economy. Its citizens stood in long lines for bread and heating oil. Factories churned out tanks instead of consumer goods. The dream of socialism, equality, and prosperity for all was crumbling under the weight of bureaucracy and corruption. And when Leonid Brezhnev, the longtime Soviet leader, died in 1982, the nation entered a spiral of uncertainty. 2 short-lived leaders followed, Andropov and Chernenko, both old, both ill. The average Soviet citizen had lost faith in the system. Something had to change. A young, energetic politician named Mikhail Gorbachev became General Secretary of the Communist Party. He was different, sharp, articulate, pragmatic. And most importantly, he believed the Soviet Union could be saved, not through repression, but through reform. He introduced 2 new policies: perestroika, economic restructuring, and glasnost, openness, freedom of speech. For the first time, Soviet citizens could question their leaders. They could read foreign books. They could even criticize the government, carefully but openly. The Iron Curtain was beginning to rust. At first, Washington was skeptical. Many thought Gorbachev was simply another clever communist with a new disguise. But behind closed doors, Reagan saw something different, a man who genuinely wanted to end the Cold War. And so began one of the most remarkable relationships in modern history. 2 men, once enemies, shook hands. Reagan, the crusader for freedom. Gorbachev, the reformer of socialism. They met again and again, in Reykjavik, Washington, and Moscow. Their meetings were tense, emotional, sometimes explosive. But something extraordinary happened. They listened to each other. For the first time, both sides agreed the arms race had gone too far. In 1987, the world witnessed a moment of hope. Reagan and Gorbachev signed the INF Treaty, eliminating an entire class of nuclear missiles. It was a milestone. The ice was finally starting to melt. That same year, Reagan stood before the Berlin Wall, the most powerful symbol of the Cold War, a scar dividing East and West Germany, freedom and control. With the world watching, he spoke the words that would echo through history. "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." At the time, it seemed rhetorical, but just 2 years later, those words would become reality. Crowds gathered near the checkpoints, shouting, singing, crying. After 28 years, the wall that split a city and a world began to crumble. Hammers struck concrete. Families reunited. Soldiers hugged civilians instead of arresting them. Television screens across the globe showed the impossible. East Germans walking freely into the West. No bombs, no bloodshed, just freedom. In the months that followed, one domino after another began to fall. Poland's solidarity movement triumphed. Czechoslovakia's Velvet Revolution swept away its communist regime. Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria all followed. For decades, the Soviet Union had ruled half of Europe through fear and control. Now that empire was dissolving, not through invasion, but through liberation. And Gorbachev, rather than crushing the revolutions, let them happen. He refused to send tanks. He chose peace over power. It was a decision that would earn him the Nobel Peace Prize, and ironically, destroy the very nation he led. As Eastern Europe broke free, cracks spread to the heartland itself. The economy was collapsing. Republics like Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia declared independence. The Communist Party's grip was slipping. Then, in August 1991, hardline generals staged a coup. They surrounded Gorbachev's dacha, placed him under house arrest, and announced that the old order was back. But the people had changed. Thousands flooded the streets of Moscow, surrounding the tanks. And at the center of the resistance stood Boris Yeltsin, the defiant president of the Russian Republic, climbing atop a tank to rally the crowd. The coup collapsed within days. The old guard had failed. On December 25, 1991, Christmas Day, Mikhail Gorbachev resigned. The red flag of the Soviet Union was lowered from the Kremlin for the last time, and in its place, the tricolor of Russia rose. After 69 years, the Soviet experiment was over. The Cold War, the longest, most dangerous standoff in human history, had ended. Not with a bang, but with silence. Children open history books. They see pictures of mushroom clouds, of the Berlin Wall, of two men shaking hands. They ask, did they really think the world might end? The teacher smiles sadly. Yes, she says, every day. The Cold War left behind no peace treaty, no victory parade. Its scars are quieter, political, psychological, economic. It shaped borders, technologies, and the way we think about power itself. The Internet, space travel, nuclear energy, global intelligence networks, all born from a rivalry that nearly destroyed us. Even today, echoes of that conflict linger. Old tensions resurface, new powers rise, and once again, nations speak of deterrence, sanctions, and spheres of influence. History may not repeat itself exactly, but it rhymes. The Cold War began with fear and ended with exhaustion. It showed humanity's capacity for destruction and for restraint. It proved that even the mightiest empires can collapse, not from war, but from within. And perhaps most of all, it taught us that in the battle between power and peace, the greatest victory is survival. The Cold War may have ended, but the struggle for understanding, that never will.